All right, so we are going to start talking about CSS now, which is the second language that we'll be learning in this course. There are three languages that are used in building web pages, and that is HTML. That's the content layer, so we learned how you can structure content into headings and paragraphs and lists and tables, so they call that the content layer. CSS is known as the presentation layer because you'll see soon that it's used to spice up the presentation of a page. And JavaScript, which we'll get to later, is known as the behavior layer, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So you can go ahead and close the HTML folder here, and then we're going to start working in the CSS folder. So you can right click on the CSS folder and choose New File. And go ahead and create a file, and you can just call it overview.html. We'll talk about some basics of CSS here. So we'll create a little HTML file here and go ahead and put in the starter code using the HTML5 snippet. We'll go ahead and update the title so that it says Overview of CSS. And I think what we'll do here, we should probably indent the head and the body elements so that we can clearly see that they are children of the HTML element. I like to have my beginning students do that. Now to get started here, let's just put a few headings on the page for us to experiment. So down in the body element, let's add an H1, and we can just make it say this is an H1, like that. And then we'll add an H2. Below that, and we can say this is an H2. Whoops, what did I do here? This is an H2 here. That'll be our content. And then finally, we'll add an H3 here, and we can make it say this is an H3. All right. Now, there are different ways that you can incorporate CSS code into a web page, and I'll show you them later in this video. I'll show you one right now. So a real easy thing for us to do is to go up to the head element. So I'm putting my cursor right underneath the title element, and we can add a style element, S-T-Y-L-E, enter, and then split those tags apart. So anything that goes inside of a style element on a web page is CSS code. So let's have a look at our CSS code here. Now we have to talk about some syntax, and this is new, so this is different than what we were learning in HTML. This is a different language here. But let's say that we wanted to make H1 elements on our page. We wanted them to be red text with a gray background. So here's one simple way we can do it. So we can create a style element, which usually goes inside the head element, and we can type this in. So we want to target H1 element, so I'm going to type in H1, and then a pair of curly braces like that. Okay, now here we're talking about syntax here, the grammar that we have to use with CSS. Split those curly braces apart, and you'll have an empty line in between them. And what we want to put inside the curly braces are what we call rules. So the first rule we're going to set is the color. And so we type in color, and then we have to type in a colon, and then the color that we want to make the H1 is going to be red, and then we have to type in a semicolon. Okay, now we have to get the syntax right, otherwise it may not work. I'm going to hit enter one more time, and we're going to add another rule here. So, and I'll explain the syntax when we finish this here. Let's set the background color. So we can type in background dash color, and notice that VS Code has the IntelliSense window to help us, but we want to set the background color to gray, like that. All right, now I'll come back and talk about all this code a little bit more in just a minute here. But hopefully if you eyeball this and make sure you get your syntax correct as I have it here, and then we'll check it out in the page here. So do Control S to save your changes, and then open it up in the browser. Whoops. Let me try that again here. Open in default browser like that, and now this is what you should see my color choices may not be the best, but you should see that your H1 element has red text and a gray background. All right, let's talk about this code that we just wrote a little bit more. So CSS code is made up of what we call rule sets. Right here is a rule set. A rule set has a few pieces in it. The first one is what we call the selector. So the selector comes right here before the curly braces. In this case, the selector determines what you're trying to target with the rules that you're creating for this rule set. So here, this is a selector that's saying we're targeting H1 elements. Okay, so a rule set starts with a selector. After the selector comes a pair of curly braces. Now that's just the rules of the syntax here. So here I have my curly braces, and inside those curly braces go your rules, or some people call them properties. But so here's one rule, and what we're doing is we're setting the color property to a value of red. Here's another rule inside the curly braces where we're setting the background color to a value of gray. Okay, now the syntax says that you type in the property name, color in this example, and then a colon. After the colon, you type in the value that you're setting the property to, which is red in this case, and then you have to end it with a semicolon. Okay, so just to review here, this is a rule set. That's what CSS code is made up of. It's a bunch of rule sets. We'll add more later here. A rule set starts with a selector, and that's where you specify what you're targeting. In this case, we're going to target H1 elements. Then the curly braces, and inside the curly braces, we put the rules. So we're saying that the color is going to be red and the background color is going to be gray. Now, a lot of people will just call these colors. So we're setting the color property to red and the background color property to gray. And then you have to have the colon after the property name and a semicolon after the value that you're setting the property to. Now, there are different types of selectors, which we'll talk about in the next video, but I started with the easiest one. This is what we call a type selector, or I call them, a lot of people call them tag selectors. I'm throwing a lot of terms at you here, but this should be somewhat intuitive to you here because it says that we're targeting H1 elements right there. So we'll talk about, there's other types of selectors that we'll be using, and we'll get to those soon. I do want you to notice that the rules or the properties that go inside of a rule set should be indented like what we have here. So my rule set starts here. If I drop a line straight down and just follow that plumb line, there's the curly brace that ends the rule. All of the rules that are inside those curly braces should be indented. Now, one thing you might see is that some people might put everything on one line, and that's okay if you don't have a lot of rules inside of a rule set. So it might look something like this. So that's okay to do it that way, but if you have a lot of rules going inside the curly braces, then it makes more sense to put each rule on its own line. These spaces are optional. If I wanted to, I could remove the space there, and I could remove the space after the semicolon, but I like to put them there just to give my code some breathing room. It just makes it a little bit easier to read here. Alrighty, so we will talk more about selectors in the next video. Let me show you a few more things before we move on here. I want to show you how you can add a comment to your code here. So if you wanted to put a comment in your CSS code, you can do the Control / keyboard shortcut. So I'm pressing Control and /, and here's what the syntax looks like for comments in CSS. So that's kind of funny syntax. It's a / and an asterisk before the comment, and then the comment ends with the reverse of those, an asterisk and a / So I can say this is a comment. So we'll be putting comments in our code every once in a while, and you can see that VS Code makes them green for us here. Okay, so now, by the way, if I wanted to remove the comment, I could do the same keyboard shortcut, Control / that toggles the comments. So anyways, I'll just leave that as is for now. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about in this video is that there are 3 different ways that you can put CSS code into a web page. The first one is by using a style element like this, and everything that goes inside of that element is CSS code. And the second way, which is really the better way, we'll be using the style element because it's nice and easy when we're just playing around and writing sample code. But technically, in a real website, what you should do is create a separate file for the CSS code. So let's all do this here. Go ahead and right-click on your CSS folder, and let's create a new file. And we're going to create a file called, let's just call it test.css. Now, this file is what we call a style sheet. A file that ends with a .css extension is known as a style sheet, and it has CSS code in it. And what we can do is we can link our web page to it. So go ahead and hit enter here, and we get an empty file. And let's add a rule set into this file right here. So let's target H2 elements. So we type in, there's our selector, we're targeting H2 elements, and then a pair of curly braces. And now I'm going to split the curly braces apart by hitting enter. And let's make the color, let's set the color to purple. So get your syntax correct. It should be color, purple, semicolon. Okay, so what we have here is a very simple style sheet. That's a CSS file, a .css file. Okay, so we can put our styles in there, or our CSS code. I'm going to save that with Control S. And now what we need to do is link to this style sheet in our web page. So go back to our overview.html file. And what we can do is put our cursor right here underneath the closing style tag. And in order to link to a style sheet, we use a link element. So type in link right there and hit enter. And now you can see that a few attributes get added here. The first one, VS Code fills it in for you. You don't really need to worry about this one, but this is just specifying that we're linking to a style sheet. You could link to other things too, but usually it's a style sheet that you're linking to. Okay, the href attribute has to be set as a path to the style sheet that you want to link to. So since both of these files are in the same folder, all I have to do for the value of the href attribute is type in test.css like that. Okay, go ahead and save your changes, and then Alt-Tab back to the browser and hit refresh, and you should see that your H2 element is now purple. Okay, so now that's the better way to incorporate CSS code into a web page, and the reason for that is that if you use a style element like this for all of your web pages, then you have to duplicate your code in every single web page. But by using a style sheet, you can link all of your web pages to that one style sheet, and then you don't have to repeat any code. You don't have to duplicate any code. So in our final project for the course, we'll be making sure that we're linking to a style sheet. That's going to be our approach here. But in class, while we're just experimenting, it's real convenient to use a style element so that we don't have to create all these style sheets. Okay, there is one more way that you can embed CSS into a web page, and I'm going to use this H3 element as my example here. So go down to the opening tag for your H3 element, and what we can do is we can add a style attribute. So we'll type in style and set that equal to a pair of double quotes, and what we can do is put CSS rules inside of the double quotes here. So let's go ahead and set the color. So we type in color, orange, semicolon. Okay, so there's a rule. If I wanted to add another rule here, I could put a space. I guess the space is optional, but let's set the background color here. So we can go background color, and I'll just set that to, I don't know, red, yellow. Sure, yellow. Okay, so you can use a style attribute and put your rules inside of the quotation marks. But this is not a recommended way of doing it, so we probably won't do this at all. It's better to put all your CSS code together rather than spreading it out amongst all your elements on a page. So although this isn't recommended, I'm just showing it to you because you might see this. Okay, if we save our changes here and then Alt-Tab back to the browser and hit refresh, there we should see the style came through. Okay, so there's your overview of CSS, a very quick one. We are going to spend the next lesson talking about the different types of selectors that you can use, and that'll take us some time.